Ambassador Dennis Jett, who is going to tell us all the secrets and the ins and outs of becoming a U.S. ambassador. And here's the book that does it. It is co-published by, among others, the American Institute for Diplomacy Studies and Training.
The Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training. Gotta get it right, Paul.
Sorry, Marilyn. Yes, I flunked the language test. But anyway, we have copies for sale after the event, and I recommend people pick up a copy. Dennis Jett was ambassador to Mozambique, and where else? Peru. And has deep experience in the Foreign Service after 30 years in the Foreign Service. We just found a common tour together in Tel Aviv. He was there 80 to 83 as a science attaché. And so he's been all over the world in the Foreign Service. I look forward to hearing his insights. And I'm also here to welcome a group from USC who are here as some students. So thank you for coming all the way from the West Coast. And you are Wayne?
I am Wayne Glass.
Wayne Glass is here. Brought these students. Thank you. The future recruits for the Foreign Service, I hope.
Well, I hope so too.
Great. So with no further ado now, Dennis will also be here to answer questions. I want to thank him for his support of AFSA over the years. I also want to mention that Ambassador Barbara Stevenson, who could have co-written this book with him, will be coming on to replace me and be AFSA president in about a month. So she will be another source of wisdom on all this good stuff. In the meantime, let's give a round of applause for Dennis Jett. And thank you.
Okay, this orange alert was arranged today to ensure I got a decent crowd, that you got some air conditioning.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne, for coming and bringing your students. It's great to see all you people from USC. Wayne and I went to high school together, back when we took our notes on stone tablets. And I'd like to thank AFSA for hosting this and for all their support. It's a great organization. I joined as a life member back in 1975 when I had some excess cash.
We no longer offer that deal, by the way.
No? They're stuck with me for life, so they have to put up with me. Whenever you have a book, there's a certain amount of negotiation that goes on, and you begin with the title. My title suggestion was American Ambassadors, where they go, so where they're from, where they go, what they do, and why they still matter. And the marketing mavens and Paul Grave Macmillan said, nah, we want the American Ambassadors, past, present, and future of America's diplomats. So, but I still think my title is better, but it's also going to be kind of the way I organize this talk, and I will attempt to speak for 30, 40 minutes and then open it up for comments and questions. We've got a lot of people, obviously, with a lot of expertise, and I'll try and throw a few hand grenades out into the crowd and see if anybody gets hit by the shrapnel. We've got various people from AFSA. Tom Boyott is one of the incoming, we're about to have a regime change in AFSA, and he'll be one of the people trying to continue with the fine tradition that Bob and Susan Johnson and others have brought to AFSA leadership. So a lot of people start with, what does the Constitution say? Whenever people say that, it usually means they want to go back to the old days when Anglo-Saxon white males with wealth ran everything. But in this case, the Constitution says the president gets to name ambassadors, ministers, and other public officials, and that the Senate gets to confirm them. That doesn't give you a whole lot of guidance, which is why one historian, and that's true for a lot of things in the Constitution, which is why one historian said the Constitution is really an invitation to struggle. And you sometimes see that struggle acted out in ambassadorial appointments. Not very often, at least less often since Jesse Helm's demise. May he rest in peace. But you occasionally see that, and occasionally it spills over into the media, and if you want an example of that, all you have to do is go to Jon Stewart's The Daily Show and type in Diplomatic Buyers Club, and you'll get a clip of a ambassadorial hearing about a year or two ago, where one of the several of the appointees gave rather embarrassing appointments or presentations, because they actually asked some not hard questions, but some reasonable questions by some of the senators present. I'm not sure what I'm going to do when Jon Stewart retires, because he's the source of all my information, but one of the things that Jon Stewart sort of pointed out indirectly is that it's probably a good thing if you don't make yourself look too stupid, whether you're an ambassadorial nominee or a government. So historically, I think I describe 3 eras of the evolution of the ambassadorial process, you might say. And they kind of line up identically with the 3 phases of American presence in the world. You've got the first 100 years, where America was an upstart former colony struggling for survival and pretty much a second-rate country, if not third-rate. And then you have the first 50 years of the 20th century, where we were a player, but a reluctant one. We got involved in World War I and then retreated into isolationism, and then got dragged back into World War II. And then the last 50 years, this is sort of round numbers, is the period after World War II, when we were the superpower, and now supposedly the world's only superpower. Well, in the first 100 years, one of the things I learned in writing this book is that the first man to have the title ambassador was Thomas Boyack. Anybody read the book and know what year he got that title? It was 1893. So, for over 100 years, when we sent diplomats out, we called them minister plenipotentiary, which plenipotentiary is a fancy word meaning they have some sort of power to carry out the duties of their office, but not ambassador, because in our small r Republican values, we didn't think that that kind of title should be given to somebody, that ambassadors were the envoys of kings and royalty, and therefore in an egalitarian country we shouldn't give that title. Finally, events abroad forced Congress to act, as it sometimes happens. The European powers decided, I guess, the United States was here to stay and a semi-serious country, so they upgraded the diplomatic representation that they sent to Washington to the level of ambassador, and Congress felt compelled to respond and began sending to European capitals diplomats with the rank of ambassador. About this time, about the end of the 19th century, there was also other events going on that affected the government and the diplomatic corps. Mr. Charles Guiteau made his place in history. Anybody know who he is?
Assassin.
Yeah.
Assassin.
Yeah. He was a aspiring diplomat, actually. Whenever in the 19th century, the sort of philosophy was, at least early on in the 19th century, was the government, the business of government is not that complicated, and any educated gentleman, of course back then it was all male, and all white, and probably no Jews, and if there were gays, they were firmly closeted. But the thought was that anybody could do it with a little on-the-job training, and so all the positions were essentially patronage, including all the diplomatic positions. So every time you had a new president, you would have a long line of job seekers queuing up and outside the office of the Secretary of State or the President. And so Mr. Guiteau went to Thomas Blaine, I think it was, who was the Secretary of State, and said, gee, I'd really like to be the minister in Vienna, which was the chief of mission in Vienna, because still at that point, 1881, we didn't have any ambassadors. And Blaine said, who are you? You have no connections, you didn't do anything for get Mr. Garfield elected president, so get lost. And so he came back the next day and said, okay, how about vice consul in Paris? And that didn't work either. Blaine still told him to get lost, and so to express his displeasure at not getting a government job, he went to see a public appearance by President Garfield and shot him. And that, together with 19th century medicine, where they didn't know about things like germs, and they were probing his wounds with unwashed hands, etc. That spelled the end of President Garfield, but it gave birth to a reform movement. There was a decision to change the system, and also the realization that, gee, maybe some of the things that the government does are sufficiently complicated that we shouldn't change all the officials every time we change presidents. And so there was passed legislation called the Pendleton Act in 1893, which basically set up the civil service, where people were hired on the basis of merit, where they were promoted on the basis of merit, and where they had some expectation of a career ahead of them, so that they would actually stay around. This was before everybody got out of government and became a lobbyist, I guess. So the expectation was that they could stay around and use these skills and talents and experience that they had for the common good, for the good of the country and the government. Of course, that didn't mean it happened to the diplomatic corps. It really didn't take place legislatively until 1924 with the passage of the Rogers Act, that you actually had a professional foreign service set up. There was, even before that, however, there were presidents who cared about this reform. Teddy Roosevelt, for instance, was a big government reformer, and President Taft was another one. He was in office for 4 years, and he made in each one of the 4 State of the Union addresses that he made during his time in office, he talked about how he had further professionalized the Foreign Service and the State Department. Not exactly the applause lines that are the stock and trade of State of the Union addresses today, but Taft thought it was significantly important that he actually do it and call attention to it. And so, as I said, he mentioned that every year in his State of the Union address. So, beginning in the 19th century, you had this professionalization, and so gradually the number of political appointees, not only as ambassador, but at the lower levels as well, declined, and the number of people who were career people went up. And then you had the Rogers Act, and then this gradual professionalization continued throughout the middle of the 20th century, and it got to the Eisenhower administration, where you went from total patronage back in the 19th century to a situation in the early 50s where about 70% of the ambassadors were foreign service officers, career people, and about 30% were political appointees. And so ever since then, that's the end of the second phase, the professionalization phase. The third phase is the last 50 or so years, and we've been pretty much stuck at that 70-30 ratio since that time, since the Eisenhower administration. President Reagan managed to bump it up to 38% political, but by sending political appointees to places like Rwanda and Malawi. I got to be beneficiary of that because my first job as Deputy Chief of Mission was in Malawi for a political appointee. These are kind of obscure African countries that only would normally have career people as ambassadors. I was replacing a woman that many of you know, Jett to Holmes, and we met for breakfast in Heathrow Airport as she was flying west and I was heading south. And she said to me, the ambassador is leaving in 6 weeks. He had only been there 2 years, ambassadorial assignments, and this was really kind of established by the Reagan administration. Ambassadorial assignments are 3 years. They like to fix it at 3 because it takes a whole year of paperwork to generate get through the process of getting a new ambassador. And so this guy was leaving after 2 because he had a son that had a medical condition that he, I guess he felt couldn't be treated by a witch doctor, which was basically about the level of medicine in that part of Africa. And so for the next 2 years I got to be chargé, which any career people will tell you is a great thing because you get to run the embassy and you also get halfway between your normal salary and what the ambassador makes. So DCMs always like it when ambassadors leave the country. Basically that 70-30 ratio has stayed. One of the things you see, or not so much anymore, but at least at the beginning of the second term of Mr. Obama, is that his percentage of appointees is much higher than the 30%. Political appointees are front-loaded in any term, whether it's the first term or the second term of a president. When a president takes office or takes the oath of office, whether it's for the first term or the second term, all the ambassadors send in their resignations. All the career people get their resignations returned, thank you very much, but serve out your 3 years wherever you are in that process. And pretty much all the political appointees get theirs accepted because there's a new crop of people that the president wants to appoint. Who does the president appoint? The career people, you pretty much know. If you've been in the Foreign Service, you know what the process is. If you're interested in the Foreign Service, you learn quickly that you have an entrance exam, and then it's sort of like the Chinese water torture. I think you have to go through a middle step now that wasn't part of the process when I entered, and then an oral exam at the end, and then the requirements, of course, to take the exam are very rigorous. You have to be older than 20, younger than 60, and an American citizen, which means it's an elite group of some 200 million Americans. But that great Western philosopher, Woody Allen, once said 85% of life is just showing up. And so about 20,000 people show up each year to take the exam, and in a normal year, to replace the people who retire, die, or otherwise go missing, they hire about 350. So it's a long, very selective process. And then that gives you a ticket to one of the 5 career tracks, political, economic, consular, management, or public diplomacy. And if you're lucky, work hard, and are successful, then 20 to 30 years later, you may be one of the 5% of Foreign Service officers who actually gets the title of ambassador. The political appointees, on the other hand, where do they come from? Well, you have to have a relationship with the president. Basically, you have to help him get elected, and you can have a personal relationship with the president. There was a man who went to Belize in the first Obama term, whose roommate in college was Barry Obama. I guess he used that name when he was in college. So that plus $100,000 in bundle contributions got him Belize. Lots of people from Skull and Bones appointed by George Bush, the secret society at Yale. So you can be a friend of the president, literally, a personal friend. The second is you can be there can be some sort of political rationale to your appointment. President Obama named John Huntsman as ambassador to China. He had been there as a Mormon missionary, spoke Mandarin. And of course, the Washington Post, always seeing a political motive behind everything that government does, published an article that said, oh, this is a sneaky plot designed to take John Huntsman out of the 2012 election. Well, it didn't work out that way. John Huntsman served in Beijing and then resigned and came back for the 2012 election, and then didn't get very far in the process. We're now seeing the next round of potential political presidential pretenders from the Republican Party, and it's probably easier to name the Republican politicians who aren't contending than it is to name all of those that are. But anyhow, didn't work out for Huntsman, but that's an example of the political relationship. And then you have the biggest group, which is about 40 to 50%, the people who give the president money. You can either give directly, and there are actually some laws that limit the amount of money you can give directly. Not that they're enforced, and we have a Federal Election Commission. If you had a vote for the most useless organization in this town, first of all, there'd be a lot of competition. But I think the Federal Election Commission, which is paralyzed by partisan gridlock, would probably be right up there among the medal winners. They would be, you know, silver, bronze, gold, whatever they got. They would definitely have a medal. So even the few laws we have aren't particularly enforced. But then, even with those laws, you can do something called bundling, which is exactly what it sounds like. You go around to all your rich friends and say, you're going to give a check to the presidential campaign, give it to me and I'll mail it in. And so you collect all these checks, you put them together in a nice little bundle, and you send it into the campaign, and then if your guy, soon to be gal, gets elected, I'm a secret Carly Fiorina supporter, as you can tell, then you can remind the White House that all this good work you did. And so in 2008, there were Senator McCain and Senator Obama each had over 500 people who bundled more than $50,000 for their election campaign. And this is something their campaigns revealed, and you can go to various websites and find out who they are. And they have a range from middle 5-digit bundlers to upper 6-digit bundlers and beyond. And in 2012, President Obama had 770 bundlers of $50,000 or more, and Governor Romney refused to reveal who his bundlers were because there is no legal requirement for him to do that. I guess like the details of his tax return, this is too top secret for the average person to know. So there are a lot of people out there collecting a lot of money. In 2008, Senators McCain and Obama spent a combined total of $1 billion. In 2012, Governor Romney and President Obama each spent $1 billion. In 2016, I've seen numbers that Senator Secretary Clinton will probably raise $2 billion for her campaign, and I'm sure the Republicans will pretty much match that dollar for dollar. And so you have this, and thanks to our Supreme Court, who believes that corporations are entitled to free speech just like people, and free speech in the form of unlimited amounts of anonymous cash for attack ads, that we will see an ever-growing electoral industrial complex that is now a multi-billion-dollar operation. So that those people will become increasingly important and important. Whether the 30% persist, I think we'll see. We won't know with Obama until the end of his term of office, but I suspect it'll be down around 30-31%. Usually, Democratic presidents were a little below the 30%. Republican presidents a little higher. So that's where they come from, where they go. As my colleagues in the department know, the political appointees generally go to islands and rich countries. Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and then the Caribbean. My cynical reading of this is that the rich countries, the relationships are usually so dense and so thick and so interwoven, and the communication so good that if the ambassador turns out to be a fool, you can work around him or her. And if, in the case of the Caribbean, if the ambassador sinks his island, nobody in Washington is going to care or notice. So from the political appointee's perspective, he wants a country that his friends will recognize and come visit. And so a colleague of mine who's a number crunching economist and I sort of did a paper on what the price of these countries are, because there's a definite hierarchy, London and Paris being the most expensive. You can pretty much work out a formula, as he did. The higher GDP per capita, gross domestic product per capita of a country, the more tourists it has, the more likely it is to have a political appointee ambassador, and the higher the price that that political ambassador is going to have to pay. Some of the data is kind of sketchy because these contributions data are kind of hard to come by, even though they're websites that put them together. But basically, we demonstrated statistically that there was, as they say, a high correlation. Other questions about where they go? Over history of African American ambassadors, 70% have gone to Africa. Even today, 60% of African Americans go to Africa. You might say, well, is that institutional racism? Why is that? Well, in the old days, it was institutional racism, or you can find in the historian's office memos written by somebody in personnel to some seventh floor principal about these are the appropriate countries to send African American ambassadors to, and, Liberia, Haiti, places like that. And sometimes there was sensitivity, perhaps too much sensitivity, to the country in question. Or are they going to be insulted? Are they going to like to receive an African American ambassador? Other possible explanations are personal interest. What you get to pretty much, if you want to stay in one particular geographic region during your career, you can do that. And then that pretty much guarantees that you're going to compete for ambassadorships if that's what you're doing for that geographic region. And so you see a lot of Hispanic Foreign Service officers specializing in Latin America, and therefore their numbers in terms of ambassadorships are likely to be in Latin America. The same thing for African Americans. In terms of acceptance of the receiving country, there's another aspect that's become somewhat more noticeable these days. As this country, one of the things that kind of strikes me about the change in this country is how rapidly LGBT rights have advanced, and now the marriage equality, etc. I think it's really kind of very impressive and very dramatic, the change. But that doesn't mean the rest of the world is following in our footsteps. The first openly gay ambassador was named by President Clinton in 1997, and of course there were a lot of senators who said, oh, this is impossible, we can't have this, how could this person with that kind of reputation be an effective ambassador, including Senator Hagel, who protested vociferously. The man in question, and all the gay ambassadors, openly gay ambassadors, have been men so far. You all know what spam is, but if you're younger than 30, you don't know what spam is. And if you're older than 50, you probably ate it at some point. Spam is the parts of the pig you can't otherwise identify or sell that's been squeezed into a little square can, and that a lot of us ate growing up because it was cheap. And when we had working mothers, it was a quick way to put dinner on the table. So the grandfather of Mr. Hormel made his fortune inventing and selling spam, and so Mr. Hormel turned part of that fortune into political contributions, which got him attention. But so he became the first, and then he took a lot of flack from that. He didn't get approved by Congress. The Senate never votes down an ambassador. The last time they actually voted down somebody was in the middle of the 19th century. But when they don't want to confirm somebody, or when even one senator wants to prevent somebody from being confirmed, then they simply don't vote. And as we all know, if it's one thing that Congress is very good at, it's doing nothing. And so you have nominations that simply languish, and if the congressional term ends, then they have to be renominated in the next term to get any consideration or to get ignored again. So Hormel got a recess appointment, and he went off and served until the end of that session of Congress. George W. Bush appointed one openly gay ambassador, a career person. President Obama appointed one openly gay ambassador in his first term, and then about a year or so ago, he nominated 5 more. And they all went through pretty much without controversy. One was sent to the Dominican Republic, and the evangelical Christians and some of the Catholic figures there in the Dominican Republic protested this and called it an insult to the country, etc. But he was accepted, and his partner is there as well. But there are other countries, there are 76 countries where homosexuality is illegal, including 5 where you get potentially capital punishment for the crime. And so it would be difficult for openly gay ambassadors to go to a place like that, or their partners. You know, what is the host government going to do when it comes to providing a diplomatic visa for the partner of somebody who's openly gay? I'm not sure, but there are those countries. So that's one thing that's made progress, but it still, I think, has a long way to go. The question of what do they do, obviously it's not all going to endless cocktail parties and not paying your parking tickets. There are some other obligations of the job. I would characterize any embassy, any ambassador, DCM trying to manage an embassy as the proverbial herding of cats, because in any embassy, the vast majority of the people are not from the State Department. They are from one of those 30 or 35 other agencies that send people overseas. And all that means is that all of those people who work for another agency, when you're the ambassador and they come in the room, they all stand up and say yes or no, sir, good morning, sir, etc. But then they leave the meeting, and then they communicate with the person back in Washington that they really care about, the person who determines their next promotion and the next assignment. And so, strange as it may seem, or maybe not to anybody who lives in Washington, different pieces of the government are sometimes hard to coordinate and get them to actually act like they're part of one broader organization. And so it is a somewhat challenging management job. And I think one of the things that Congress has done is in 2008, it passed a law that said the Inspector General reports, you can't hide them anymore. As you know, government secrets are top secret, confidential, and then you've got limited official use, or sensitive but unclassified, I guess is what it's called now. That last category doesn't mean that revealing it would be any threat to national security like the other 3. It just means that it might embarrass somebody. And so all of these inspection reports by these inspector generals of these different agencies were usually classified that, and there's no declassification for that, so they could keep them out of the public eye indefinitely. But Congress said, it doesn't work that way anymore. You have to redact the parts that are sensitive for national security, and the rest you have to put on your website. So now, for those of you who want some late night reading, I urge you to go to the Inspector General of the State Department's website, and you've got pretty much all the inspection reports on all the embassies back for at least the last 6 years or so, or 8 years, I guess. And I'll just give you 4 quick examples of some people who are mentioned in this report. I think this is a great thing because it provides some transparency. The other thing it does is government is always challenged in measuring what it does, measuring how well it does something. You can usually agree on what the goal is, then you talk about how to implement it, but then when it comes to actually doing it and measuring results and providing some feedback and modifying it, that's a challenge. I mean, you're not going to hear Secretary Kerry ever say, well, our foreign policy was 14.6% better this quarter than it was last quarter. It's not going to happen. Even if you were in town to say that, but he's going for the record for frequent flyer miles. But you can go to these inspection reports, and they always start with a section on how well the ambassador and the DCM did. And so in the case of Kenya, you had a former Air Force general who was appointed by Obama because he was a former Air Force general who provided some campaign support and the endorsement of a former military officer, which is important for Democrats, less important for Republicans, because Republicans always like to say they're stronger on national security because there's no amount of money they're not willing to waste on national security, and so therefore they've got to be stronger. But Democrats like to have generals and admirals endorse them. So this guy went off to Kenya and he attempted to use a military style, management style, in the herding of these cats, and he failed miserably, and there were other kind of strange things. How he communicated, I think he used his Gmail account to communicate. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? Anyhow, his report was not glowing. The morale of the Post was rock bottom. In the Bahamas, you had a woman from Hollywood. That's a rich source of political contributions for Democrats because Hollywood, like the Democratic Party, is trying to undermine family values and other kinds of things and make profit from it. And so this woman was named to the Bahamas, and the only problem was that she didn't bother to go to work. She was out of the country about 40% of the time, and when she was in country, she worked at home because, I don't know, she didn't like her office or what. There was a man named to Malta. She was a money raiser. The first guy was the political. The third example is a guy who went to Malta, his contribution was he was a Republican Catholic lawyer who endorsed Obama and got denied communion for his efforts, but he got Malta as a reward, and then he went off there, and I guess he thought his role was ambassador of God because he spent most of his time writing articles for religious magazines and neglecting things like managing the construction of a new embassy. So his report wasn't great. And then the kind of best of the bunch, if you will, was a woman who went to Luxembourg. She was described as a venture capitalist. I think basically she inherited a ton of money and ventured with her father or grandfather's capital and used some of that for political contributions. And she was such a stellar manager that people in Luxembourg, in her staff, were volunteering for Baghdad and Kabul to curtail their careers in Luxembourg and or their service under her, and to go off to those garden spots that were always looking for people, and probably still are. So those are, I think, some examples. There are others. These are all political appointees, but there are some career people who got less than stellar reports. And so all four of these people resigned after the report came out. So I think that kind of transparency is helpful. The only problem, of course, is that according to the law, the Inspector General is supposed to inspect a post once every 5 years. They actually do it about once every 8 years. So they go to Congress periodically and say, well, we don't have the money or the staff. And it is an intensive process. You've got about a dozen people who go to a country and spend about a month, and they talk to everybody in the embassy. Everybody in the embassy fills out questionnaires. I guess they count all the paper clips to make sure that nobody took one home. I'm not sure what they do, but they do kind of a thorough job, and perhaps too thorough because it involves a lot of resources and money, whereas if they probably did a more cursory look and focused on what mattered, how policy was being implemented and how the post was being managed, it might be easier to do once every 5 years instead of once every 8. So one of the things I did as a professor, as Wayne will tell you, you can subject your research assistants to all kinds of torture and in the name of research. And so I had 4 of my graduate students go through the IG website and read every inspection report and give every ambassador a grade, 2 grades, one for internal management and one for external relations. So the 4 of them independently went through and assigned these grades, and then we gathered data and crunched them. And the career people came up with a slightly higher grade for both internal management and external relations. But according to my number crunching economist friend, the difference between the political appointees and the career ambassadors was not statistically significant. So I think that gives you an idea of the difficulty and the challenge of measuring. All right, let me quickly say why it matters. I think probably this is a bit like preaching to the choir. Why it matters, I think I asked my students to define globalization in a single sentence, and they struggle to do it because some of them can name various aspects of globalization. But my one-sentence definition is it's people, things, and ideas crossing national boundaries with greater speed, frequency, impact, and reach. And I have to throw in a comma or a semicolon because it's got to be one sentence, right? Usually driven by technology, it's neither new nor reversible. And so what that means in terms of foreign relations is even though we're the world's only superpower, we are not all-powerful. Any problem we face, we have to do, if we're going to face it effectively, we have to do it in concert with other countries. When we had the big Ebola scare, people said, well, let's stop flights from Liberia or Sierra Leone or wherever. Having spent 2 years and 2 fun-filled years in Liberia, I can tell you there are no direct flights between Liberia and the United States. You always go through Europe, and so it just, rolling up the welcome mat doesn't do it. Of course, Ebola was that big scary thing. Only one person died from Ebola, and that was a person who contracted it in Liberia. He came here and went to the hospital, and they said, oh, no health insurance or ability to pay. Here, take 2 aspirin and call us in a year or 2. And so he went home, and the fever got worse, and he died. So the big Ebola scare that was sort of nonstop on CNN and other places turned out to be not that scary, but it's still a potential problem that the South Korean president just canceled a visit to the White House because he's addressing a health problem in his country. So, but you can't do that unilaterally. You can't do that by yourself. So you need to have a international cooperation. You need allies. You need and a lot of them. Lincoln Chafee, as you may have noted, announced that he was going to run for president as a Democrat. And one of the things that he included when he made this announcement that was mocked by Jon Stewart was that he thinks the United States should go metric. Well, there are only 3 countries in the world that aren't metric. Liberia, Myanmar, and the United States. And Liberia and Myanmar are in the process of going metric. And so pretty soon we'll be the only country that isn't using metric. I mean, when this came up back in the 70s, and there's been a long history of attempting to go metric that actually stretches back to George Washington. When there was legislation to actually do that back in the 70s, the Cowboy Hall of Fame protested and went to court against it, saying their argument was the West was won mile by mile, and therefore we don't like this idea of meter by meter. We stole this land from the Indians and the Mexicans, and so we did it by taking it, acre by acre, mile by mile, whatever, but not by meter square or otherwise. And so it just hadn't prospered. And that's, of course, not the only thing that we managed to opt out of. There are 36 treaties sitting in front of the Senate, and as you know, ratification or approval of a treaty requires 67 votes by the Senate. And as you know, you can't get 67 senators to agree on the time of day or anything else. And so there's a treaty on the rights of the child that I think only 2 countries have not ratified, Somalia and the United States. But then again, neither of them has a functioning government, so I guess that makes sense. There's a treaty on the law of the sea that the Pentagon wants, the industries want, but the Senate won't approve because there'll be an international organization created. And whenever you say international organization, for some people you can hear the horror of those black helicopters that don't show up on radar, that are going to be run by the world government, and they are going to someday swoop down and carry off our women folk and livestock and, worst of all, our guns. And so anything that implies international cooperation or a new organization is sometimes difficult. There was a treaty on the rights of the disabled. Bob Dole went to the floor of the Senate and sat there in his wheelchair and urged his Republican colleagues to vote for it, and they went up and shook his hand and then slapped his back, and then a sufficient number voted against it that it failed. What would the Treaty of the Rights of the Disabled do? It would take the standards set by our law, our Disabilities Act that creates all those little ramps and other accessibility things, and it would basically apply it worldwide and encourage people to meet our standards. And yet we can't ratify it because, I don't know, I mean, the arguments are beyond silly. So I think those kind of things demonstrate that it make it difficult to cooperate on issues. We'll have a continuing debate about is what is being negotiated with Iran, is that a treaty required 67 senators, or is that some sort of executive agreement that we can get around that requirement? It will just go on and on. So I think that's a fundamental problem. I think it's basically due to the influence of domestic politics and a lot of xenophobic, paranoid delusions. And I think it will make it harder for us as a nation, to carry out a coherent foreign policy. And that's why I think that we need the best diplomatic representation that we can possibly have. In the Foreign Service Journal, there was a review of my book, which said, oh, it's a good book, but it didn't come to any hard and fast conclusions. Well, I've written 3 books, and I like to avoid taking a Rodney King approach that we can't all just get along. The reality is that, and one of the criticisms was, what I did suggest was non-controversial and minor. Well, if it's non-controversial, why hasn't it happened? I mean, the status quo exists because it benefits somebody, and those people are going to resist any change. It's not always just inertia, or it's not the absence of an idea, a bright idea on the part of some academic. So I think some of the things we could do is get more serious about the appointees. We have a man now, ambassador in Argentina, who speaks conversational Spanish. Great, what does that mean? Is this a kindergarten level conversation? Or is this a college graduate level conversation? And so we've got the Foreign Service Institute that gives lots of language exams. Why can't they give that exam to potential nominees, career and political? And why can't that become part of the public record that the senators get to look at before they consider whether to vote on this person? And so I think transparency is needed, transparency about political donations, so you have a sense. It shouldn't be allowed, like Mr. Romney, to sort of say, you can't know who my bundlers are. We should actually, if I wanted to make a pie-in-the-sky ideal suggestion that will never happen, it would be to get money out of politics. Good luck with that. It ain't going to happen. But at least it ought to be more transparent about where that money is coming from and who's spending it for what purposes. And then I think given the transparency that we now have with the Inspector General reports, that's great. But if we have inspections once every 8 years, then that's about 2.5 ambassadors who come and go before there's another inspection. And so my suggestion would be to have an electronic survey every year for every post and every bureau, so that you would have some measure of what the morale is, or what the feeling of the people who work at that post is with regard to the management, both in the bureaus and in that building over there, and also embassies overseas. And this also ought to be public knowledge. I remember one inspection report of the Africa Bureau, which mentioned that morale has improved greatly since the departure of the previous assistant secretary. So I don't know that we really need to suffer that. The other thing, when I talked about the 70-30 ratio, there is now a 70-30 ratio in the State Department, but it's 70% political appointees, 30% foreign service officers, as any of you who have read the American Academy of Diplomacy recent report know. And that, I think, is not a good thing. But again, when you're running $2 billion campaigns and you have all these staffers who then, once you get elected, are interested in getting jobs, there are a lot of positions over in the department that have nice sounding titles, not as great as ambassador, but those policy wonks. The people who get jobs in the department, they don't give money, but they do give their time, and they do provide the support that seems to be necessary to get elected. But I think there ought to be a limit to that as well. We're about to have regime change in AFSA. The new team is going to come in and is going to use its diplomatic skills to look for win-win situations. Well, I only wish them luck. If there were easy solutions to this problem, A, I would put it in my book, and B, it would have been achieved by people like Susan and Bob already. And so I think there is, I'll wind up with this point and then throw it open to any comments or questions. I think AFSA is never going to be able to be as aggressive as it needs to be in defending, first of all, defending the country, not just defending the narrow interest of foreign service officers. And all of this accountability would apply not just to political appointees, it would apply to career people as well. But when you're sitting there talking as a representative of AFSA and the other guy on the other side of the table determines your next assignment and whether you get promoted or not, that's not exactly a negotiation where you're going to have a outcome that's going to be for the benefit of your side to the extent it should be. That's hard to do because AFSA, of course, is composed of people who still think they have careers, and do have careers. But one of the things I would suggest is that you've got lots of people like me and some of the others in the audience who retired sometime some years back, but despite that still have a few brain cells left. But we also have the luxury of being able to express ourselves. I've got over 140 op-ed pieces in various newspapers, and the first one I wrote was back, actually I was still in the department, that I was at the Carter Center for my final assignment, and I had just written this book on peacekeeping, and things were falling apart in Sierra Leone, and so the Atlanta Journal-Constitution asked me to write a piece on peacekeeping for their editorial page, and so I did. I thought, hey, this is kind of cool. I get to express myself. I don't have to be restricted to the company line. And besides, I'm at the Carter Center. If they complain, I'll tell them I work for the State Department, and if the State Department complains, I'll tell them I work at the Carter Center, so I'm covered. And then I retired, and so, 140 op-eds later, some of which is because I worked at the University of Florida, now at the Penn State University, and so I would get those emails that started, I read your article in the newspaper, and as a taxpayer of Florida, I just want to say, and you knew what was coming next. I guess they figure if I got paid by the state of Florida or the state of Pennsylvania, I had surrendered my freedom of speech, but I refuse to do that. But there are a lot of retirees out there who I think if we're organized, perhaps it would require a completely separate organization from AFSA. But one of the things I used to say in Latin America is there are a couple things that don't translate into Spanish. Fair play is one of them. And the other is write your congressman. But write your congressman still works in this country. If you write your congressman and say you want to make a contribution, you'll get a quicker response. But nonetheless, there are a lot of people out there who could write their congressman, not worry about the effect on their career because their government service is behind them. And I just think that AFSA or somebody ought to do something to mobilize those people. The guy that was nominated for Norway, who didn't know what kind of government Norway had, didn't know what kind of business opportunities might happen in Norway, was actually not confirmed. And so his nomination was not resubmitted. So one small victory for competence. But I think in part it was because of efforts by Tom Boyott and other former AFSA officials, but it was also because I discovered there are more Norwegian Americans than there are Norwegians, and a lot of them live in Minnesota. And the entire Minnesota congressional delegation, both senators and all their congressmen, wrote to the president and said, don't approve this fool to go to our country as our representative. And thank God he's not going. So with that, the idea that occasionally victory is possible, I'll throw it open. I'm sure there are lots of comments. There's lots of a wealth of talent in this room, and please.
And we have a mic, so just raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and we'll pass it along to you.
Hi, my name is Kinshasa Brown, and I am Congressional Liaison Officer at the EPA, and I love working for the EPA, but I'm here because I'm interested in possibly a career change. So I was just curious, so this might be, I say all that to say it might be a silly question for folks who already know, but so a career service officer, is that a diplomat? Are they the same title? And are the diplomats, if they are career service officers, appointed by the president, or is it just ambassadors who are appointed by the president?
Well, there's the civil service and the foreign service. The civil service in the building across the street is full of them, are people who work in Washington. They may travel overseas, but they spend their careers in that building. The foreign service, you go in through the exam process. You are appointed by the president. It's kind of a formality. It goes back to that constitutional requirement of naming people. But you go through the exam process, and then you're hired, and then you're available for worldwide service, and you move around from embassy to embassy. And so you get a different retirement system. You get exposed to every disease known to mankind. You get to go to countries where a substantial portion of the population would like to kill you. Nothing personal, it's just that this is their way of protesting American policy. So that's a completely separate career track, and it has its benefits, it has its costs, and it's not a lifestyle for everybody, but I would urge you to take a look at it and the other opportunities in the department as well. But thank you for your work in the EPA, and that's a critically important agency as well.
Jack Martin. The communications revolution has really changed the work of diplomats, and I'm wondering how that really factors into your book. I don't know in terms of recent time any rogue ambassadors who have complicated foreign policy because of the fact that they've wandered off the ranch and done things on their own initiative that they shouldn't have done. But it's very difficult to do these days with the modern communications revolution, that there's not that much freedom of action. You're watched every movement you make by Washington, and you're told what to do or told what not to do very often. So I'm wondering how you think that really factors into the modern situation of naming ambassadors. It's probably not as disastrous anymore if you have somebody who is not terribly well qualified, other than perhaps in the aspect of public diplomacy, where they are not able to perform as well as somebody who's trained in diplomacy.
Yeah, I don't really talk about that too much in the book, but you're right, it is a complicating factor, and I guess I would say two things. First of all, fortunately, Washington can't walk and chew gum at the same time, so their attention span is somewhat limited, and so they're constantly putting out whatever the fire of the day is. And so I remember Bob Gribben, a colleague of mine, was ambassador in the Central African Republic, and he said being ambassador there is great because people in Washington think it's a direction, and I get to run pretty much, I know what the policy is, I get to implement it with my team without any, oversight really or micromanagement by Washington. So there are lots of parts of the world where that's still true. I think, though, it's complicated, as you said, by this modern communication, and that, I think, it gives opportunities for amateurs to make the United States and themselves look stupid, and in rather dramatic ways. Our ambassador in Japan is Caroline Kennedy. She gave, a couple $100 to the Obama campaign, but bestowed the mantle of the Kennedy legacy on Mr. Obama, and so that was her contribution. And she got Japan, and one of the things she's done is go on Twitter. And of course, Twitter goes out to the world, and so when you say something stupid, it can have some blowback. And so she criticized the Japanese because they have a practice, apparently, of herding wild dolphins into a bay and killing some of those dolphins for food and capturing some of them for zoos and letting the rest of those dolphins go. And so she criticized this policy and said that this practice and it ought to change. So I can think of no more effective way in an Asian culture of getting a policy change than publicly embarrassing somebody, the government, and doing it through social media. So it provides, I think, opportunities for people who aren't that great. And then, of course, the whole language ability question comes into play. When I would come out of a meeting in Lima, people would stick cameras and still and video cameras, and then there would be a couple guys holding up cell phones, and they would ask me questions. And I knew the guys with the cell phones that what I was saying was going out live to two all news stations, radio stations. And so you have to have some, despite the gringo accent, I was able to, I think, communicate effectively what the policy was. Or I remember one meeting, they had been tipped off that I was going to get chewed out for something I said. And so I came out and they said, well, what did the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs say to you? How was the meeting? And I said, well, Mr. Holyfield just had a fight with Mr. What was it? The other prize fighter. And I said it was more civilized than that, the meeting. He didn't chew my ear off, literally, but so anyhow, but you got to be able to respond in those situations, and of course, with the media, the social media. I wonder about all of these people with Twitter accounts and sending out little things, and it kind of baffles me that there's any particular point to that. One of the first things I do in my first class with my students is I have them read, there was an article in the New York Times several years ago about digital diplomacy and how this is the best new thing and how it's going to revolutionize everything. And so I have them read that and tell me why it's baloney. It is a platform, it is a mechanism but it has to be used carefully, and if it's not used well, then it quickly backfires.
Hi, my name is Ivy. I'm with University of Southern California, so with Dr. Glass. So I actually have two questions in regards to Foreign Service in general. So, well, based on the classes I've taken before on the foreign policy, one of them is, you know, in the early, in 2006 and after, you know, we have the debate on who lost Iraq. And at that time, the Secretary of State's Condi Rice suddenly increased the number of foreign service workers in the region. So, and then people saying, you know, the foreign diplomacy actually started to become a political tool. And, you know, people make same arguments when, you know, appoint John Bolton as a U.S. ambassador to United Nations, and also you're saying, you know, we can still say it today, even though you mentioned that under the Obama administration, the things has become better, but you know, in regards to the United States relationship with North Korea, diplomatic relationship seems like is conditional. It's like only if North Korea meets certain kind of conditions, then there will be a normal diplomatic relationship with them. So my first question is, do you think that you know, the diplomatic relations today is conditional in some circumstances? And my second question is, we all know what happened back in 1998 or 1996 about what happened in Nairobi, Kenya. The bombing tragedy happened. So Prudence Bushnell, the ambassador at that point, and saying before it happened, she had provided sufficient evidence to the CIA and the key decision makers in DC that there was a high risk, but people just ignore it, and so it happens. So do you think that kind of the problems, the communication problems between the foreign service worker abroad and the key decision makers here in DC, do you think this problem is still existing today, you know, based on your experience? So here are my two problems.
Yeah, well, the second question is sort of a Benghazi type question, and you know, maybe I should just ask Eric Boswell to respond, but part of the reason you should consider going into the foreign service, as I said, is there are people in each country, not each country, but some countries where they'd like to kill you. That's always been true. It's probably maybe a little bit more true today, again, thanks to globalization. Ideologies of hate can cross borders, weapons of mass destruction, techniques of terrorism, etc. But it's an inherently risky occupation. People in the diplomatic security probably get 50 requests a day. We have 276 diplomatic embassies and consulates around the world. They all have varying degrees of need for protection, physical protection. The flip side of that is if you create a fortress that's impossible to get in or out of, then you sort of cut yourself off from the population that you're serving. So it's always hard to, and of course you don't have an unlimited budget either, so if these 50 requests come in, somebody at a deputy assistant secretary level is sort of sorting through them and saying, yes, we can do this now, this is high priority, this is something that's going to be expensive and time consuming and going to have to take more time, but the end result is diplomats get killed, the same as soldiers do. It's unfortunate when it happens. In Benghazi, the man, Chris Stevens, died of smoking inhalation, not because somebody was trying to kill him, but they were attacking the facility, and unfortunately he got caught inside. I think he had been there when the operations moved to Benghazi, when Gaddafi was still in power, but there was never a consulate in Benghazi. I don't think there was any intention of keeping a consulate in Benghazi, so it was all kind of temporary. So you have to say, well, how much money do you want to invest in a temporary facility? And I think he probably knew, or felt he knew the situation on the ground well enough that he could go there and be safe. And then, I don't know to what extent the video had much to do with it, but you can argue about that. But it was a risk. He took the gamble. Do the same calculation, ambassadors do the same calculation every place in the world. I went to, after I'd been in Lima for 6 weeks, I went to a diplomatic reception at a colleague's house. I was from 7 to 9. I left at 7:15. Sorry, I got there at 7:15, left at 7:45. At 8:15, terrorists broke in and took 600 people hostage, including 9 of my staff members. And so the word went out that I had known in advance. I had gotten intelligence, and that's why I left. Actually, it was my management style that allowed me to leave my people behind to be taken hostage. But so, one of the terrorists expressed to the economic counselor some disappointment that I'd left. But that was for half an hour, and the fact that I had to go to the airport to pick up my mother, who was coming in for the holidays. So, sometimes it's just bad luck. You try and make the decisions that you can based on what you know. People overseas always want more security, but the funds are limited. So, but it's an inherently risky situation. I think all the noise that's being made about Benghazi is about 99.9% of it has to do with trying to forestall the inevitability of Hillary Clinton as candidate. It has nothing to do with caring about those poor people that died. It's all about domestic politics. Your first question about, I think diplomacy is inherently political, and so that's what you're there for. You're there to communicate your views, the views of your government to the host government, and communicate the views of the host government back. That doesn't mean it doesn't get wrapped up in politics. That, as you said, some people are saying, who lost Iraq? Well, we never won anything in Iraq. I was going to write a book about how I screwed up Iraq, but I never got there, and it wouldn't have probably sold many copies anyhow. But we have Jerry Bremer, I think, in large part to thank for the creation of the insurgency, which raged and got worse and worse and degenerated into a civil war in about 2006. And then we had the surge. Well, it wasn't a surge of American troops that mattered, and I have nothing but respect for American troops and what they do, and I'm continually astounded at the sacrifices we ask of our men and women in uniform and the lack of sacrifice that any of the rest of us make. You remember George Bush, when asked what Americans could do, he said, go shopping to stimulate the economy. Well, and this is at the same time people in the reserves are going back to Iraq for a third time and a fourth time and a fifth time. So we had 30,000 additional troops there. There's a country of 28 million people. 25,000 of those troops never left Baghdad. What happened was that the insurgents had largely alienated the local population, but what really happened is we put the people that Jerry Bremer created as insurgents, the people who had been in the Ba'ath Party and in the Iraqi army, who were, when he de-Ba'athized the government, disbanded the army, he created this mass of people with no stake in the political or economic future of Iraq, and so they decided to, well, we're going to destroy it. So you can go to, there's PBS station Frontline, there's a little clip on there by the great General Petraeus, who in 2004 wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post saying that training of Iraqi soldiers is going great, that our leadership is in the fight. Not only is there a light at the end of the tunnel, there's no tunnel. This was 6 weeks before Mr. Bush was reelected after an accomplishment-free first term, and about a year before General Petraeus strapped on his 4th star. So double mission accomplished. But it didn't mean that we had, as we see every day in Iraq, an army that was willing to fight. So we put the Sunni people, the Sunni insurgents that Jerry Bremer created, on the payroll. And this clip on Frontline by General Petraeus says, yeah, I put 103,000 insurgents on the payroll. And then Frontline said, yeah, and it cost $400 million. But they had a stake in Iraq. And so you saw the supposed victory was just a lull in that civil war that we created. And then we left. We had to leave because Mr. Bush signed a status of forces agreement which said we were going to leave, and no Iraqi politician was going to agree to extending the stay of an occupation army without putting those soldiers under the Iraqi judicial system, and no president was going to agree to put our soldiers under their judicial system. And so we left. Mr. al-Maliki, who Chris Hill managed to keep in power, because he was a strong man and Iraq wasn't ready for real democracy, he said, well, I'm not going to pay these Sunni insurgents, the heck with them. And so what did they do? They went back to destroying the country. They morphed into ISIS. The people in ISIS are largely former generals in Saddam's army. And now we have a resurgence of the civil war. And now we have proposals that we should train Sunni militias, because we can't rely on Shiite militias to win every battle, particularly in Sunni parts of Iraq. And so now we're going to train Sunni militias. So you would think that my generation is more familiar with this, but you would think we had seen this movie before. In Vietnam, we tried to support a corrupt, incompetent dictatorship with an army that wouldn't defend its own government. And guess what? We lost, and nothing happened. But that only required 58,000 dead Americans and maybe 2 million dead Vietnamese. We have another situation where we have a corrupt, incompetent government whose army won't defend it, and no matter how many more advisors we send over there, I don't think it's going to change. They say, oh, in 2 years of training, the Iraqi army will be ready to fight. Well, they say Brazil is the country of the future and always will be. I think the Iraqi army is 2 years away, training away from being a real army, and always will be.
Do one more.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Jett, Dennis. This book is terrific. I've read a lot of your research that went into it, I think, and as Princeton Lyman says, it could not be more timely. And Richard Butler says this is the best book on this important subject yet written. I'm the chair of the Committee on the Foreign Service Profession and Ethics in AFSA, and frankly it is pretty appalling to have the 30-70 split on the ambassadors still in this late 200 plus years in our history, and then the 70-30 that the AAD report has talked about. All that said, though, as a retired Foreign Service officer, I had a couple of very, very fine, distinguished political appointee ambassadors who frankly I adored a lot. And I had an absolute abhorrent Foreign Service career officer serve as my ambassador. And he effectively terminated my career. And I love the fact that you got your research assistants to do that numeric study. And I've been using that in the committee to talk about, well, what we can change, and what we can't, maybe we can't. But one of the things it seems to me that we have to change is how to improve the overall quality of the career Foreign Service ambassadors. I would love to get those political appointee ambassadors out of there altogether. But part of the case, it seems to me, has to be that we are a professional Foreign Service. We pull up our socks, we do the best possible job, and we knock the socks off of everybody else that's trying to get into our business, the business of diplomacy. But anyway, I'd sort of like to hear what you have to say on how we can improve the nature of the Foreign Service and make it more professional.
Good, yeah, I agree completely. I'm not saying that the 30-70 split is bad. What I'm saying is when you hire or when you give ambassadorship solely on the basis of political contributions, you sometimes get real turkeys. But the first, and I talk about this in the book, the first ambassador I worked for, he spoke, this was in Argentina, he spoke great Spanish. He looked, if you called up central casting and send somebody who could play the part of ambassador, this is the guy that would have showed up. He actually was a movie star at one point. But he was a fool. And the political appointee that replaced him must have set a world record because he had been ambassador in 5 Spanish-speaking countries and still could not put together a coherent sentence in Spanish. And so even language ability isn't necessarily a great indicator, but he was a good ambassador. And so there are very good, I think one of the things we found in our study was the political appointees tended to be more likely to be very good or very bad. The career people clustered around the middle. But I think one of the challenges for AFSA is this a professional organization or is it a labor union? Are you going to protect everybody, including the incompetent and people who ought to be fired or not get ambassadorships or positions of responsibility? Or are you going to insist on raising the standard and demonstrating that we do have the skills and the ability and do therefore deserve to have the role that we want to have? This is why I think that the transparency, accountability kind of thing is important. Why the AFSA came out with these standards for ambassadors. Nice effort, but I don't think anybody's going to look at those standards and say, oh, I guess I don't meet them. I mean, this group, there was a group of former ambassadors that put together these standards, and there were some very distinguished career people on this committee. But there was the guy who was in charge of White House personnel under Obama, a guy who had been ambassador in Brazil, bought himself the ambassadorship and was there for a grand total of 1 year, and a prep school and Yale buddy of George Bush. So, you know, what kind of standards are they going to come up with? They're going to say, well, you should, you know, these are the standards. You should be good at what you do, and you should be a good manager, and you should be this and that. But it's not really going to prevent anybody from stepping forward. What I think having that language test might prevent some people who, if you don't speak Spanish, then maybe you shouldn't put yourself forward for a Spanish-speaking post and get that exposed. You can't get away with saying, I speak hola, como está, type Spanish. And the other is the accountability that would come from a more vigorous IG office that did have annual inspections, and again, for the department as well as all the embassies overseas, and they could identify if you've got a place where morale is rock bottom and it's not due to be inspected for 5 more years, you ought to send a team out immediately to do an inspection just of the management function. And if those reports, as they did in the case of the 4 examples I mentioned, get made public, maybe that level of accountability would deter the truly incompetent and unqualified from applying in the first place. But even if they did get the job, it would hopefully make their time as ambassador a lot shorter. But I agree with everything you said and hope you have success in your committee. Yes. And if anybody has other commitments and need to go, feel free to. I've had people walk out on me plenty of times, so I don't feel bad. So, thank you all for coming.
Dennis, it's great to see you again.
Yeah.
And I wanted to get you to get into one other aspect of diplomacy in the appointment of ambassadors I think is really significant, and that is the embarrassingly long time that it takes our Senate to confirm ambassadors, leaving many essential posts vacant for long periods of time. And I felt this myself in my last tour before I retired in the Netherlands, which is one of our older and closest friends of the United States, when an ambassador had been appointed, had been nominated rather, went through his hearings and then made the terrible mistake of giving an interview to a Dutch journalist before the Senate did the confirmation vote, and talked about the amount of money that he had given for the presidential campaign. Senator Sarbanes was still on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and would not allow anybody like that to get confirmed, so the appointment withered. The next, in between that appointment, which never took place, and the succeeding ambassador, there was a presidential election. And when Bill Clinton came in, the first thing that he did was appoint certain ambassadors, but the Netherlands was not among them. And finally, when we did get an appointee, political appointee, who turned out to be really wonderful, it was 20 months between ambassadors. It was an embarrassing thing. And when this new ambassador presented his credentials, the Queen told him, well, the president has finally decided to send someone to represent him in my kingdom. I mean, that is
Yeah.
abominable. What can we do, and what can AFSA do, to try to speed this along and convince our Senate that they are hurting the image of the United States and the work of diplomacy by holding up these nominations for so long?
Yeah, well, there are two problems. One is sometimes the White House doesn't go through its process quickly. We went 2 years without an ambassador in Ireland. The only thing, this was denied by the White House, but the only thing I can assume is that they got somebody and started the process and discovered some conflict of interest and then jumped that, and then they dug up some Catholic lawyer from St. Louis, and Clara McCaskill went to his confirmation hearing and introduced him and says, this guy is going to be a great ambassador to Ireland because he was, just until last week, an Irish citizen. Oh, no conflict of interest there. But anyhow, sometimes it's the White House, but these days, increasingly, it's the Senate. The person who's now in Peru, I think he spent over a year. It's like 15 months, and he was a career person. No controversy. Part of it was this exercise of the nuclear option in the Senate voting procedures. But I think all we can do is encourage the press to focus on these delays. It's incredibly wasteful, incredibly bad for our conduct of our foreign policy and our image. And so I think that's about all we can do is, and again, this might be an opportunity for retired foreign service people to get organized, to write letters to relevant members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I hope Senator Corker, who I think is a serious guy, will approach this with more alacrity than has been in the recent past. But yeah, it's pathetic, but it's a perennial problem.
Thanks everybody for coming. I think we're going to cut it there. We appreciate you showing up, sir. We really do.
Okay.
Love your book. Thank you all.
I'll be around if anybody wants to chat further. If anybody has a question they were too embarrassed to ask, you can look up my email address.